Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream history podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Meredith J.C. Warren. And for those unfamiliar with her, Meredith Warren is a senior lecturer in biblical and religious studies at the University of Sheffield. She is known for her views on the New Testament and early Judaism, as well as for her media appearances for such outlets such as the Washington Post and BBC Radio. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield, where she is the director of the Sheffield Center for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies. She also oversees the Embodied Religion Research Theme. In addition, she is the editor-in-chief of the Open Access Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies. Principally trained in both early Christianity and early Judaism, she approaches religion and antiquity from an interdisciplinary perspective that challenges category assumptions about early Christian Jewish literature. In her research and teaching, her goal is to showcase the intricacies of shared cosmological expectations among the communities of the ancient Mediterranean. She has written often on food and taste and antiquity, and more recently she has undertaken research on gender, including rape culture and Revelation, and an article on slut-shaming the Samaritan women. Well, it's good to have you back on History Right Podcast, Professor Warren.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Today's video is based upon food and transformation in ancient Mediterranean literature. I have the link to the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below, so you can go get her book and other books as well that she's published. So I'd like to start off with basically, if you could provide a brief introduction to like what the book is about. I mean, obviously it's about food and transformation in ancient Mediterranean literature, but if you could expand a little bit of what specifically you're talking about before I get to the questions.
Yeah, so in this book, I'm articulating a new genre of eating, transformational eating in literature. So I'm not talking about communities sharing food or communities having meals together, although I think there might be implications for that. I'm really talking about something that occurs in a bunch of literary texts across the ancient Mediterranean. And I give that genre of transformational eating a name. I call it hierophagy, or the ingestion of holy or sacred things. And the easiest way to explain it is not to use a biblical or ancient text, but to talk about it with reference to Alice in Wonderland. And so many people are familiar with this story, and so it just really helps people understand the sort of category that I'm talking about. So Alice, as many of you may remember, tumbles down this rabbit hole. She's following the white rabbit, who's not really important to my research, but she ends up in this liminal place, right? In the Disney film, it's like this room with the door at the end, and it's big and empty and whatever. And it's definitely not Wonderland, and it's definitely not her own world anymore. So she's left her own world and she's entered this other world. So in this liminal space, she can't actually access Wonderland at this point. And to do so, she needs to ingest some food and drink, right? There's an eat me cake and there's a drink me bottle that she has to ingest. In the book, drinking and eating those things actually gives her knowledge. She now has the knowledge to shut herself up like a telescope, which she then does, and is able to enter into Wonderland. So this is basically the pattern that I'm looking at with hierophagy, is that someone is given food from another realm, and eating that food or consuming that food changes the person in three ways. So they are physically changed, they are able to relocate to that other realm, and they are given otherworldly knowledge. They're given this new knowledge. So that happens to Alice. All three of those categories happen to Alice. Other examples that I talk about don't hit every single one of those. They might hit two, but not the third, for example. But I think they're still useful to think about. Now that you know the pattern, you might notice this happening in all sorts of other places. And my book only really talks about these Hellenistic and Roman era texts to late antiquity. But for another one that is sort of in the footnotes somewhere buried is the film Spirited Away, where Chihiro is sort of disappearing as she's entered the spirit realm, and she has to eat something from that realm in order to remain there. So there's tons of examples all over the place. Every time I talk with someone from another discipline, they tell me, oh my gosh, this is This is something that happens in like Irish folklore, for example. So as you're listening, I'm hoping that you're coming up with other examples that might that you might be familiar with. But that's the general idea.
And just a reminder, this is the book, everybody. Again, the link is in the description below. All right. So, can you tell us a little bit about Persephone? Because you talk a bit about in the first chapter about the Persephone traditions, and Homer talks about a bit about this, obviously. So, can you tell us about like how that connects to food? Because Persephone is connected to the death and rebirth of nature in some way, like some major ways.
Yeah. So this is actually the Homeric hymn to Demeter. So it's like sometimes attributed to Homer, but it's not actually Homer. But these are really important texts. There's Homeric hymns to all sorts of divinities. And so the story of Persephone gets told in different ways by different authors. So I reference the Homeric hymn to Demeter just because it's one of the earlier ones. The one that I actually spent some time with is the sort of examples that are in Ovid's work. But basically, the story of Persephone is that she is kidnapped by Hades or Pluto, however you want to name him, and she's taken down into the underworld. And she isn't actually a permanent resident of the underworld until she tastes the underworld food. And this is a condition that comes up in all of the texts. So it's really interesting that the gods are aware of this kind of cosmic law that if you eat something from another world, that relocates you to that world, whether you like it or not. So this is a conversation that she's having with her mother in this example here, where Demeter says, "My child, tell me, did you not taste food while below? Speak out and hide nothing, so we both may know. For if not, ascending from miserable Hades, you will dwell with me and your father, the dark-clouded son of Kronos, honored by all the gods. But if you tasted food, returning beneath the earth, you will stay a third part of the seasons each year," right? So Demeter is really concerned that Persephone might have eaten food while she was in Hades. And of course, as readers and as hearers of this story, we know already that she has in fact done that.
What does Ovid's Metamorphoses tell us about this?
Yeah, so this is another example, and I wanted to bring this example in because the Homeric hymns to Demeter are quite a bit older than many of the other examples that I look at in the book. So Fourth Ezra, Revelation, Perpetua and Felicitas. And so I wanted to be able to trace the idea into, you know, the Hellenistic and Roman periods and not just say, well, this isn't something that's still sort of in the cultural, you know, vibe when we get to these other texts like Joseph and Aseneth. This is something that, you know, starts a lot earlier, and, you know, I think you've got a slide on Genesis coming up later, but this is something that's quite a bit older. I also have some Assyrian and Sumerian texts that do this, but I haven't talked about them in the book. Anyway, it's an older tradition. It continues in the Greco-Roman period, and it extends after that as well. So there are later examples of this development. So Ovid's kind of my bridge to that, saying that, you know, this is an ancient tradition. It's in the water at the time of these sort of Jewish and Christian texts, and Ovid provides another example, another retelling of the Persephone story. And one of the important things about that comparison is that you know, it shows these common elements that are in both the older Homeric hymn edition and in Ovid's, right? So there's still this cosmic law where eating food from the underworld or from another realm kind of locks you in to that location. It changes you in some sense. And so pointing out that that's a common category that exists in both of those texts was important for me to lay the groundwork for looking at other examples as well.
Can you tell us about social intimacy and sensory intimacy? What do those things mean?
Yeah, so one of the aspects that I talk about in my book is the question of why the sense of taste and eating food works this way. And I had a lot of fun actually reading a lot of theoretical and philosophical texts about taste. And one of the scholars who really influenced me was Carolyn Korsmeyer, who wrote a book on the philosophy of taste, and that was great. And Maggie Kilgore was another one. Those are the two main sort of theoretical influences for my work. And both of them point to the fact that with other senses, a lot of the times that sensory experience can be shared. So with scent, for example, it's something that's in the air. Any old person walking by can smell that, and it doesn't take away the scent from anyone else walking by, right? That's a shared scent. With sight, okay, it's there in the world and you're seeing it with your eyes. Other people can see it with your eyes. The object is still there, it doesn't disappear. But with taste, you are literally destroying the object as you experience it, right? And we can sort of put to the side for the minute the example of meals, because I think that's actually really important. But for the sake of this, like when you are taking a mouthful of something, you are destroying that mouthful. No one else can taste that particular mouthful with you. So in that sense, it's very intimate. Okay, it's a very personal experience that no one else really shares with you in a real sense. And so when you're sharing tastes with the divine, that becomes really important. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on with that intimacy, and I think that's really significant, and that's why a lot of apocalyptic or apocalyptic-ish texts end up using this trope.
So, what does Genesis tell us about food, or more specifically, like, what do you make of Genesis 3:6 to 7 when it talks about when the woman saw that the tree was good for food?
Mm-hmm. This is one of my favorites, and I wish I could have spent a little bit more time on it in the book, but because it dates from so much earlier than my other texts, and I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar, I had to kind of just like wink at it and move on. But I think this is such a really interesting one because, of course, it's a synesthetic experience that the woman is experiencing, right? She sees that the food is good, right? That the tree is good for food. It's a delight to the eyes, and so there's this kind of mixing of sight and taste in that. That she can kind of imagine with her eyes what it's going to taste like. And we have a couple of the criteria for hierophagy happening here, but kind of in reverse almost. So where, Alice in Wonderland, she eats something and she gets to enter into Wonderland. Here, the ingestion of this fruit results in the expulsion. But we can also see that the tree was desired to make one wise. So we do have that acquisition of knowledge that's a really key component of hierophagy, as we saw in Alice in Wonderland briefly, and we'll see in other texts as well. So the only thing, I mean, you could make an argument maybe that the appearance has changed because of the recognition of nudity or nakedness. But I think at least we've got two of the three elements of hierophagy in here. But yeah, because it's one of the more ancient texts, I put it in there because it's not too far off from the Homeric hymn to Demeter in terms of date, but it was largely outside of my sort of bookends. But I couldn't resist including it.
Actually, before we get to this, could you introduce what Fourth Ezra is about to the audience before I ask about that?
Sure, yeah, it's so in terms of genre, it's an apocalypse. So it's a piece of revelatory literature. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with the end of the world. We kind of have changed the definition of apocalypse in contemporary thinking. In antiquity, apocalypse was the revelation of something. Apocalypse literally means revelation. That's why we have a text called Revelation in the Bible, is because it's literally an apocalypse. We just translated that word. So an apocalypse has various elements in it. The primary one is that there is something revealed to a character in the text. In this case, it's a character called Ezra, purporting to be a biblical Ezra, but it's not a biblical Ezra because it was written around the destruction of the temple in 70. And in Fourth Ezra, we have a series of revelations. I'm not calling them visions on purpose because some of them aren't visions, some of them are auditory, and that's really important that there's this sort of sensory progression in the text, where Ezra is, provided with cosmic information from God by way of an interpreting angel called Uriel, which is another component of apocalypses. There's a mediating angel usually. And so Ezra receives this series of revelations, and in the end, he is sort of given this fiery cup, and he is instructed to write these books. And it's like a new Torah, basically. It's like a new set of scripture, some of which are hidden. And so that fiery cup, in that sense, actually facilitates the transmission of divine knowledge that allows him to write those new books. It's a fascinating text. It's not super long, and there's a really interesting chunk in the middle where a woman turns into.
So what does Fourth Ezra tell us about like its thoughts about food, the fields?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting text, and you can see that there's 7 revelatory episodes. And the first couple are just sort of a speaking voice. So Ezra hears a voice. So they're auditory. We progress through other examples where Ezra has visions, which start with eating flowers from a field. So we have the 7 days of fasting, and we have eating flowers from a field, and then finally we have this fiery cup. And so you can actually see a really nice structure in this text where a certain amount of meditation and then fasting opens up space for the divine to sort of punctuate the earthly realm. Eating unusual foods like flowers from a field allows for a more, an even more intensive type of revelation, which is a vision rather than just auditory. But the most intense form of revelation only happens after Ezra is handed this fiery cup to drink, right? And it says his heart poured forth understanding. We get that knowledge element.
Hmm.
Oh yeah. So here's this sense where he's eating. He's been fasting, and now he's in this field, which is a part. It's set apart from the human realm in some sense, right? No house has been built. There's no agriculture there. It's only things that are grown naturally, right? There's nothing to do with human beings in there. So he's separating himself out from the human community in order to make space for the divine. And this is something that fasting also partially accomplishes. So Carla Schulzbach has written a great article on this phenomenon, how fasting allows the divine to punctuate the human realm in apocalyptic text. So if anyone's interested, take a look at that one too.
Can you tell us a bit about the corpse that this is talking about? And my secondary question to that is, can you talk about Ezra's lack of heavenly wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a running joke, right? Because like he gets these long revelations that are quite profound, and as a reader, you kind of maybe struggle also to understand them. But this is supposed to be like the main character, right? He's supposed to be a little bit more in tune with this stuff. And I just love this line, right? I lay there like a corpse and I was deprived of my understanding. Like he's just totally bamboozled by this. He has no way of understanding what he's just experienced. And the angel gets kind of fed up with him, right? What is the matter with you? Why are you troubled? Why are your understanding and the thoughts of your mind troubled? Like the angel's just like, what is going on here? I thought you were supposed to be like the guy that we were going to explain all this stuff to, and here you are lying on the ground, and you're kind of being a dummy. And so Ezra says, I'm doing all this thing, I'm seeing all these visions, but I just really don't get it. Okay. And then as Uriel has to do the job of explaining all this stuff. But what's really important from my work is that it's clear that without the fiery cup, without this heavenly material that Ezra in the end ingests, there isn't that kind of divine understanding. That only comes with the hierophagy that happens at the end of the text.
So now we're at a passage here when it talks about how he awoke in great perplexity of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's another example of, exactly this thing. Like Ezra keeps getting these, no matter whether he fasts or he's eating these special flowers, he's doing exactly what God says, but it's not enough for him to actually understand what he's being shown or what's being revealed to him. He's getting weaker. He's begging for someone to understand or to explain it to him. He says, like, you judge me worthy to be shown the end of times and the last events of these times, but I'm just not getting it. And it's only a few chapters later that he finally does get it when he ingests this fiery cup.
Why does Ezra have issue interpreting visions? Does the text explain that?
I mean, he's just a mortal guy, right? Like God's ways are kind of incomprehensible by definition. It's a similar theme that you find in Job as well, right? Where God is kind of showing off how incomprehensible things are. So, I mean, I think it emphasizes the specialness of the material that Ezra is understanding, or that Ezra is being shown, that God is giving him special access to this, even if he can't understand it. And it's also like, as readers, we're getting access to that too, right? Like it's so special that Ezra had to have an angel interpret it for him so he could understand it properly. And guess what? At the end, he wrote these books down, which actually distill all of that information. So it really elevates Fourth Ezra as a text to this special category. And that's kind of what apocalypses do generally, right? They're showing off that they have this privileged knowledge, and only people who sort of understand it in the same way as the apocalyptic author can actually know what God's really thinking. So it's kind of a, come over here and I'll show you something super cool deal here. So the more Ezra doesn't understand, the more special it is. I mean, you have this in the Gospels as well, right? The misunderstanding motif that the apostles, the disciples just like aren't getting what is going on with Jesus. So this is a literary technique that's common.
And Ezra talks about being given a drink.
This is the bit. Yeah. What are we gonna say?
No, that was about it. Like it's talking about giving him this drink,
Yeah. So this is fun because in the scholarship, people talk about divine drunkenness and like, is this some kind of like distilled spirit or something like that? But the text is opposite, right? Like it says, when I had drunk it, my heart poured forth understanding and wisdom increased in my breast, for the spirit retained its memory and my mouth was opened and was no longer closed. Like, okay, I'll give you the last part, like my mouth was open and no longer closed. Like maybe if you're drunk, like you will talk a lot, but seldom would you say that a drunk person has increased wisdom and retaining its memory, right? Like this is not a drunkenness situation. This is something completely different. It's very special, right? A voice calls Ezra, and this is the only time where God actually speaks directly to Ezra. Every other example is Uriel, the angel, speaking on behalf of God. So we're really like, we should really be attuned to this, right? God is speaking directly to Ezra for the first time. And we have this sort of mysterious cup offered to Ezra. We can't really see what's going on here, whether it's just sort of floating in front of him or there's a hand coming down out of some clouds. And it's an unusual material that's in this cup, right? It's something like water, but its color was like fire. I mean, that's really interesting. And that's another trope of sort of apocalyptic literature where the descriptions of various elements in the apocalypse are almost indescribable, right? If you think about the throne in Revelation, it's almost indescribable in sort of its flashing description. So we know that this is a divinely provided cup. We know that it's a divinely provided liquid. And he drinks it and just has this, like, an epiphany, right? He finally gets it. We've had 14 chapters of Ezra not getting it, right? Having Uriel have to explain everything to him, and Ezra sort of lying on the floor and complaining about not being able to understand everything. I mean, he's not getting it up until this point. And then finally, oh my goodness, this is it. He finally understands everything, and he's able to remember it, right? And then we get sort of the commissioning of the new books.
Can you talk about Revelation chapter 5 and the Lamb?
Sure. So I'll just sort of step back a little bit. So the reason I engage with this text is because later in Revelation, the seer, John, is instructed to ingest a scroll. And there is debate about whether the scroll that he ingests is the same scroll or a different scroll than the earlier scroll in Revelation 5. So I don't think it particularly matters one way or another, but we can see that there's something special about these either one or two divine scrolls. And Revelation, I mean, the author of Revelation is basically like a scriptural pickpocket, right? Like he's rifling through as many allusions as he can and packing them all into this really intense apocalypse. And so it's not necessarily that there is sort of a coherence to this text in the way that I think we might like there to be. I certainly would like there to be a coherence to this text. I haven't found it yet. But this text is in there basically because either this is the same scroll that John later ingests, or it's a different scroll. Either way, we've got a really important fixation with scrolls and writing in this text, and they're associated with the divine realm.
How does Revelation chapter 10 parallel Ezekiel?
Yeah, so I mean, this is another example of John kind of pickpocketing from earlier texts. There's tons and tons of allusions to earlier prophetic literature. None of it, interestingly, is an exact quotation, which I love. So John is giving like a prophetic vibe without actually giving any authority to those earlier texts, which I think is a real, it really demonstrates the sort of desire of the author to establish himself as the primary authority of the divine realm. So if you look at these two texts, the Ezekiel one is on the left and the Revelation one is on the right there. And in Ezekiel, we've got the prophet, we've got a hand stretched out and a written scroll. It was spread out with writing on both sides. And you see that the writing is sort of bad news, okay? And then we get this call, Son of man, eat what is offered to you, eat this scroll and go speak to the house of Israel. So Ezekiel does this and he eats the scroll. And when he's eaten the scroll, he tastes honey. He tastes the sweetness of honey. And then he's able to go and continue his prophetic work. Now, there's a couple of differences between Ezekiel's version and Revelation's version. So we have, again, a scroll and it's open. We don't have any indication that there's writing on this particular scroll, but we can presume there is, I guess, if we assume that it's the scroll from Revelation 5. Again, we've got an interpreting angel here rather than direct communication with the divine realm, which is typical of apocalypses. And most importantly, we have a different selection of flavors here. So I distinguish in my book between taste and flavor. Flavor is what you taste, okay? So it's going to be bitter in the stomach and sweet in the mouth. So we have the same sweetness that Ezekiel experiences, but actually when it's in John's stomach, it will be bitter. And that's exactly what his experience is when he eventually eats it. And then we again have this commandment to go and continue John's prophetic work. I will say something important about this, sorry, before we move on. And a lot of people, and this sort of connects with the Persephone stuff earlier as well. The location of taste receptors in the body is something that I also looked at. So in the earlier Persephone texts, you can see that Persephone actually tastes the pomegranate on her lips, and the descriptor of her tasting them is on her lips. Here we have the taste receptors in the stomach. Antiquity has different ideas about the sense of taste than we have, but I will say that we actually have taste receptors way beyond just our mouths. It was fairly common in antiquity for lips to be the focus of the place where people were tasting things. That's pretty common. That's not unusual. That's not a weird Persephone thing. That's something that's found elsewhere as well. But we do have taste receptors in our stomach. We have receptors all over our body. Even in those of you who have testicles, congratulations, you have taste receptors in your testicles. So it's not weird necessarily for us to imagine ancient people understanding taste receptors in a different place, because we actually might experience that if we were paying attention to them a little bit better, rather than sort of focusing on these weird, like this tongue map thing that's totally not right. Okay, that's my that's my rant.
Before I open up to the next slide, can you tell the audience about Pseudo Julian's letter to Serapion? What is that about?
Okay, so this is, the only reason I bring this in is because there's all this debate about what is going on in Revelation with the bitterness and the sweetness. Okay, so in Ezekiel, the stuff that's written on the scroll is not nice. Okay, it's sad, boo, but the scroll still tastes sweet. So some people say, well, Revelation scroll tastes bitter in his stomach because it's just bad news and he's going to unleash all these woes on everyone. Okay, so that isn't, fine, but I think it actually is doing something a little bit more than that. And when we look at the medicinal understandings of different flavors, I think that can provide a different way of thinking about that. Like, I don't think it's wrong to say that it's because there's bad news coming out of that scroll, but I think it's doing more than that. I don't think John is ever necessarily only doing one thing with his imagery, right? Like, this is chock-a-block intense imagery going on. So, so one of the things that the ancient medicinal community understood was that bitterness was a mark of the efficacy of medicine. And I don't know if you want to get the slide up now, and I can sort of refer to that.
You can go ahead and do that. It's fine.
Yeah, can I have the slide to have a look at the text?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay, so yeah, so this is what Pseudo Julian. This is this little medical text here. It's later than Revelation. Indeed, Hippocrates says that honey, though it is sweet to the taste, is quite bitter to the digestion. Okay, so this is the problem, right? So sweet stuff is not supposed to be very medicinal in this sort of philosophy, and so the medical professionals of the time are like, why is honey such good medicine? It's sweet. It shouldn't be good medicine. And so the understanding is that actually, once you digest it, its nature is actually bitter. And so actually, we shouldn't be categorizing honey as a sweet product at all, because once you digest it, its function is like that of a bitter thing. It has this really effective medicinal quality. So he sort of signs off on this, for it would not change this bitterness if in the beginning this quality had not belonged to it, from which it changed in the reverse. So basically arguing that it's not really a sweet medicine because sweetness isn't really good medicine, bitterness. So I don't know if anyone knows, I think this is a Canadian product, but there's like a cough syrup called Buckley's. Is that in the States as well? Anyway, it tastes awful, but it works, right? That's the slogan of it. So this is something that's really carried on in our belief system, that like medicine has to taste bad for it to work really well. And the Buckley's cough syrup family have obviously capitalized on that. But that's what this is doing. So this is trying to explain this. I use this text to try and explain what's going on in Revelation, right? So Ezekiel's scroll is just sweet. And John doesn't like that. Sweetness isn't good medicine, okay? Bitterness is good medicine. That's more effective. So John is positioning his seer as more authoritative than Ezekiel in this sort of amendment to that scene.
Can you tell the audience about Joseph and Aseneth? What is that text about exactly?
This is one of my favorites. So this is a Hellenistic Jewish romance novel about the patriarch Joseph of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame and his biblically referenced in 2 verses wife, Aseneth. And I guess those 2 little bitty references weren't quite enough for the fans of the Joseph narrative. I don't know. But someone went and wrote a romance novel about how Joseph and his wife met. And what's really interesting is in the biblical text, it says that she's the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Okay, so she's not Jewish. And so the romance novel actually narrates not only how she falls in love with Joseph and how he eventually falls in love with her, but also relates how she decides to become a worshiper of Joseph's God. So that's kind of the general overview of the text. It's not an apocalypse, but in the middle of it, there is an apocalyptic scene. And that's where this example of hierophagy takes place. It's part of Aseneth's transformation. And to be honest, like it's kind of the romance stuff is kind of put to the side. This central scene has nothing to do with whether she's going to marry Joseph, and has everything to do with like the cosmic realities of Aseneth herself.
Can you talk about the connection of honey to mystical experiences that Joseph and Aseneth talks about, and how that correlates with Proverbs 25:16?
Yeah, so I mean, this is just an example of is this Proverbs 25 or is this okay? Basically, throughout the Bible, you have references to sweetness, and sweetness is associated with the divine realm. So this is, I mean, I mentioned a whole bunch of examples, I think. So Wisdom of Solomon, History of the Rechabites, which is a pseudepigraphic text, Psalms, Proverbs, a whole bunch of places. And Fred Tappenden and Stephen Muir have actually written about God's sweetness and divine wisdom. So that's a really great text if you can find that one. And so this is just one of many examples where divine sweetness is associated with honey specifically as a descriptor. So in the History of the Rechabites, ambrosia comes up from the ground like honey, and it's associated with the divine realm. That's how heaven is described, as having this sort of honey coming up from everywhere. The manna is described as tasting like honey, right, when it comes down from heaven in the Wisdom of Solomon. And why honey is specifically important. First of all, it gets mentioned in Persephone text as well. The pomegranates are described as sweet like honey. That is a little bit unusual. If you've ever tasted a pomegranate, I would describe them more as tart than sweet like honey. So there's something marked about that hyper sweetness that comes with honey. But in Joseph and Aseneth, it's not just a comparator. The thing that she ingests is actually a giant chunk of honeycomb. Okay, so the honey is really important for Joseph and Aseneth's story.
And can you tell us about the bloody finger in the Joseph and Aseneth story?
Yeah. Okay, so we're in the middle of this text. Aseneth has caught sight of Joseph, and she's fallen in love with him, and he won't have anything to do with her because she worships her Egyptian gods. She goes up to her room and has a little cry, quite a big cry, actually. And when she's finished crying, and putting ash all over herself and dressing in mourning clothes and everything like that, she notices that a heavenly being who looks suspiciously like Joseph in every single way has appeared in her room. And she offers this person some refreshment, as you do when an angel appears suddenly in your chambers. And he is like, don't bother calling for your servants. Go and have a look in your room because there's a table with a honeycomb on it. And like, that's quite odd. And so she goes back, and indeed there is a honeycomb, but it's not like an ordinary honeycomb. It's white as snow. It's pretty special. In my head, it's kind of glowing a little bit. So she's like kind of astonished, and she provides it to this angelic visitor, and he marks it. Okay, so he's marking it with his finger. This is one of these scenes where like every single scholar has kind of an idea that they're going with for interpreting what the heck is going on here, but there is literally no consensus about this text. So some people argue that this text is actually Christian, and that drawing the finger from the east to the west and then from the north to the south actually makes a cross. And so he's making a cross on this thing, and it's a Eucharist. And I mean, I can see how that's very tempting, but in my experience, there's nothing particularly subtle about early Christians. And if they wanted it to be a cross, they would say cross. So I think there's something else going on here. And I think it fits really nicely into the idea of hierophagy. Okay, so anyway, he's marking this in some specific way. I think the four corners, the four directions are really important because they kind of represent the whole of the world, the whole of the cosmos. It's the four directions where the sun rises, where the sun sets, right? These are really important. It represents the cosmos. Okay. After this point, I don't know if you have another slide of Joseph and Aseneth or not. No, maybe not.
I don't believe I do. Let me check.
Okay, I'll just talk through it again because what happens
I do not have another slide.
he breaks off a piece of this honeycomb and feeds it to her, and she tastes it in her mouth, and some bees, actually some heavenly bees wearing little crowns, come and start to rebuild the comb on the broken bit of comb. And then the angel, I mean, he's never called an angel, but I'll just go for it. He's called the Anthropos, the guy, says, have you understood this thing? And as a reader, you're like, I have not understood one bit of this thing. But Aseneth says yes. And the Anthropos then says, the guy says, your name is written in the book of the living in heaven. So you have been relocated to that special realm. You understand this. She says she's understood this thing. And then after the Anthropos takes off, Aseneth is like, oh my gosh. First of all, he tells her to put on her wedding dress. And then she looks at her reflection, and she's like, oh gosh, I'm filthy. But then she goes to wash, and she's transformed. She's so transformed that her servants don't recognize her and think she is divine. Okay, so there's physical transformation, the transmission of divine knowledge. She knows this thing, okay, and the relocation that is indicated by her name being written in the book of the living in heaven. So this is another example of hierophagy, which is why I think this is not an example of some sort of very subtle, unusually subtle Eucharist. This is something else that is better placed in conversation with 4th Ezra, with Revelation, and with the other texts that I talk about in my book.
What is Apuleius' Metamorphoses about?
So this is another novel. This is a Latin novel, and it's a comedy. Basically, once upon a time, there was a man who spied through a keyhole, saw something he shouldn't see, which was a witch transforming into a bird, decided to break in, steal the ointment, gets the ointment wrong, puts it all over himself, hoping to become a bird. In fact, he turns into a donkey, and has to, he goes on, hijinks ensue, basically. He gets into all sorts of really bawdy and raunchy trouble. Eventually he gets he's always quite sad about being a donkey, and he doesn't know how he's going to transform back. Eventually he gets a vision of the goddess Isis on a beach, because she's associated with the ocean, and she's like, guess what, there's going to be a procession tomorrow, all my priests are going to be there, there's a priest who knows to look out for you. If you eat this bouquet of roses and become a disciple of mine, you will turn back into a human being. So he goes and does that and ingests these roses, which are often, rose petals are often used in sweet cooking in antiquity. Rose flavor was really, important for various polenta dishes and things like that. And he is transformed. And the next portion of the book, which is a lot less exciting than the first part of the book, just forewarned, is a description of him becoming a disciple of the Isis cult. In ancient Rome. So that's kind of interesting. People who study mystery cults really like that, because we rarely get descriptions of mystery cults. I'm particularly interested in how, again, a divinity from antiquity is recognizing that there is these special laws about how transformation occurs, and is sort of going with them and working within those cosmic regulations. It's kind of an interesting example because it's the only example we have where someone has changed back into their original form rather than transformed into some sort of angelic or heavenly adjacent form. So that's kind of an interesting one. It's also the only example we have of like non-human to human rather than like human to angelic. So it's still working with those kind of ontological categories, but in a different way.
And what does Apuleius' Metamorphoses tell us about its views of food and drinks? Is it similar to the other stuff we were talking about earlier, or is it different?
I think there's a lot of things that are a little bit, there's a lot of similarities and there's differences. So if we're thinking about Persephone, for example, and Aseneth, and even to a certain extent with Ezra, we've got things that are like recognizably edible. Revelation uses something completely not edible. So the scroll, you don't usually go around eating scrolls, although one time I gave a talk at Nottingham, University of Nottingham, and they baked me a scroll cake, which was amazing. So the roses in Apuleius are kind of in this middle ground. So on the one hand, rose petals are an ingredient in cooking, but there's no way that you're just going to like munch on a bunch of roses. So they're kind of in this, they're not really in the same category as like food in and of themselves, like honey is or like pomegranate is, but they're also not in that category of the scroll where it's like definitely not something that people ordinarily eat. Yeah, so it's a little bit in between there, but it still functions in the same way, right? So he is physically transformed in some way, and it also allows him to begin his initiation into this other realm, which is the Isis mystery cult, right, where he gains all this privileged knowledge, which he then actually partly passes on to us.
Can you tell us about the ontological hierarchy regarding Lucius's experience?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I just kind of alluded to, right? That there's like an ontological hierarchy in these texts where animals are sort of the baser category, humans are in the middle, and then the divine are at the top. And so in this example, he's going from one ontological category of animal into the higher one. Whereas, for example, in Aseneth, she starts out as human and she gets her name written in the book of the living in heaven. So she's going up an ontological category as well. It's just a different ontological shift level to Lucius.
All right. So my closing question, what connects Fourth Ezra, Revelation, the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, and Joseph and Aseneth together?
It's this hierophagy. So we didn't talk about Perpetua and Felicitas, but a similar thing happens there where this woman Perpetua, the text is in the form of a diary, and scholars debate whether it's an actual diary or whether it's pretending to be a diary. If it is a diary, it's one of the earliest authored texts by a woman. There are earlier ones, but it's one of them. And she is in prison and she has these visions. So again, it's a little bit apocalyptic-ish, although it's not an apocalypse at all, but she's having these divine revelations. And one of them involves her dreaming about this ladder going up to heaven. And so she goes on this ladder, it's covered in knives, there's all sorts of serpents all over that she has to stomp on, right, with this allusion to Genesis and crushing the serpent's head, right? She's crawling up this ladder. When she gets there, there's this old dude milking a sheep. And she is instructed to put out her hands. She collects some of the, it's ambiguous what this is, either milk or cheese or something in between, like kind of a ricotta. There's a lot of pages on cheese, and I had a great 3 months researching cheese for this bit. She eats it. It tastes sweet, right? So that's really interesting. Ricotta is used in sweet dishes as well, but it's marked that it tastes sweet, right? It's not feta, which is a sharp taste. And after that, all the people who are in heaven say amen. She wakes up and she understands, she has divine knowledge that she is going to be martyred in the arena. Okay, so after that, it says she had no more hope in this world. So she changed her allegiance from the earthly realm to the heavenly realm. She has divine knowledge. She also has quite a bit of physical transformation. So in the book, Perpetua has recently given birth and she's nursing her young baby. After she has this vision and has ingested this cheese, her milk completely dries up. Okay, and she no longer feels pity as much for her baby. She's totally disconnected from this world. So that's a really interesting example. Again, another example where people are really interested in labeling that particular cheese meal as a Eucharist, a type of Eucharist, but actually Perpetua experiences her initiatory Eucharist at a different point in the book. So it's unlikely to have happened twice, really. Yeah, so that's kind of how they're connected, is this common thread of hierophagy where characters are ingesting something from another realm, another cosmological realm, and they are transformed in one or more of these three ways, right? Physical transformation, relocation to another realm, or recipient of divine knowledge. And that's the category, the literary trope, the genre, whatever you want to call it, that I'm defining for the first time.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Meredith Warren.
Thanks for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.